So good afternoon, MOCA friends, and our virtual guest. My name is Neil Wu Gibbs, pronounced Datum, Director of Programs and Chief of Staff at the Museum of Chinese in America. As we're concluding Women History Month, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this engaging talk with Tessa Hulls, an artist, writer, and adventurer, as she digged into her genre-defying graphic memoir, Feeding Ghost. This touching narrative interweaved the lives of 3 generations of women in her family: her Chinese grandmother, Sun Yi, her mother, Rose, and Tessa herself. Extensively researched and beautifully rendered, Feeding Ghost is Tessa's homecoming, a vivid journey into the heart of one family, set against the dark backdrop of Chinese history. By turns fascinating and heartbreaking, she exposed the fears and trauma that haunts generations, along with the love that binds them together. Her graphic memoir, it is a testament to the enduring strength of family bonds, the complexity of history, and the power of storytelling. So if you enjoy today's program, please consider buying her book. We have a special, our program, rate is $28. We do have a credit card swapper if you want to purchase. And then, of course, Tessa herself would sign the book. So, kind of after her talk. And then, of course, also, we also will appreciate if you want to support the museum. Your generosity is vital to our institution and help us create more programs that will inspire and uplift diverse communities. So you can donate on our website, and also we accept cash, Venmo, and PayPal. We do have QR codes that you can support us. So for our virtual guests, we also encourage you to submit questions anytime during the discussion for the Q&A. So the event is also being recorded for on-demand viewing on MOCA's YouTube channel. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Tessa to start the talk. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you to everyone at the museum. It's really wonderful to be here. And so, today I thought that since I have a little bit more time, we have an hour together, that I would give you a little bit of an overview of what I was doing as an artist and writer before I started this book, because it all kind of weaves together. So I call myself an artist, writer, and adventurer, and this is what inspires me. This is a picture that I took when I was working down at a science research station in Antarctica. I love pursuing deep frontiers and bringing back what I find. But before I was a genre-hopping maker, I was a painter, and that was my most polished medium. And I used to work in really brightly colored gouache, and actually, a lot of my work was paper cut. So I would spend like 60 hours working on a painting and then just take an X-Acto knife to it. And I don't know if this is going to play, but just to show you like the level of detail in what I do, there's my hand for scale. So I am not somebody who shies away from very repetitive, detailed work. These are some pictures from a series that I did called How Goes the Battle back in Seattle. And all of the shows that I do, there's always some phrase of text that gets lodged in my head. And that ties in with feeding ghosts, because that sentence was, someone has to feed the ghosts. And I make work to understand what those phrases mean. In general, there's really 3 questions that guide my practice. How are we connected to our histories? What does it mean to be a strong woman? And how do we find our way home? And I think in the earlier part of my career, I asked these questions on maybe an individual level, but as I sort of moved into the more established part of my practice, I really started feeling like what I did as an artist needed to respond to what was going on politically in the world around me. So this was a series that I did in conjunction with the Asian Counseling and Referral Service in Seattle. And this was right after Trump was elected and he was passing wide immigration bans. And so I partnered with their senior social club and got to hang out with really amazing first generation elders talking about their stories of coming to the US and what home meant to them. So I made these portraits based off their stories of coming here. This is another project that I did for an organization called Break Bread, Break Borders. And this is a group where women come together. They're refugees and they cook foods from their homelands, and they have these huge community dinners, and they use the ticket sales to fund this program. And so I was hired to talk to them again about their stories of coming to the US and turn those into comics. And then I also got to illustrate their favorite recipes, which was awesome because in another life, I am a chef. Um, the other thing that I do is I spend a lot of time digging in archives, and I give 2 illustrated talks that weave together primary documents, archival research. One is looking at the 150-year history of the bicycle as a tool for social change and liberation. And the other is looking at a series of female explorers who lived through the turn of the 1900s. For the one that's about bicycles, a lot of what I do as an artist is look at the broader societal factors going on around times of change. So I looked at the history of the bicycle, but then put it against a backdrop in terms of what was happening in terms of both gender rights and civil rights. Um, I talk about how the bicycle really liberated women to start playing around with new forms of dress and gender roles. And some of my favorite things for this are like early comics. This one, The Awful Effects of Velocipeding, was basically men were afraid that once women got on a bicycle, they were gonna stop following all of society's rules and just go wild, which absolutely. Um, this is a newspaper illustration thrashed by a lady cyclist of a man was catcalling a woman who biked by, and she just got off her bike and punched him. And sometimes what I do is I'll take these long talks and then I'll turn them into condensed posters with all the information on one sheet. So the other talk that I give is looking at how a series of innovations in communication technology allowed for a group of 7 women to, for the first time, understand that there were other people doing these sorts of really incredible things. And when I'm doing this kind of research, I'm always trying to find particularly women of color whenever possible, because they're the ones who have been so excluded from the record. So this is Ada Blackjack. She's a Native Alaskan woman who is known as the female Robinson Crusoe. She was sent out on an expedition north of Siberia with 4 men and 1 female cat, and all the men died, and she and the cat survived. This is Bessie Coleman. She is the first woman of African American and Native American descent to ever get a pilot's license, and she had plans to become a female stunt pilot and raise money to start the first all-Black flying school before she unfortunately died early in a plane crash. So as I started working more around social activism and uncovering the stories of women of color and figures in history, that started to trickle into what was happening in a more contemporary sense. And so back in 2020, when the uprisings for racial justice happened, Seattle ended up having the Capitol Hill organized protest, which was an autonomous zone that sprung up. And this was happening somewhere that I used to live. I used to live 4 blocks from there. And so I decided to go in and see if I could lend some context-based journalism as to what was happening. And since this was during the depths of COVID, a local arts nonprofit just outside the barriers said that I could sleep on their conference room floor. So I meant to go for 3 days, but then accidentally went viral as a comics journalist and ended up staying for 3.5 weeks until the final police clearing, and just set up a 1-woman news crew in this empty conference room and just reported out what was happening during this really volatile and contentious and confusing time. And it was really sobering to see just how much media was distorting what I was seeing firsthand on the ground. And, you know, as part of that, I was getting a lot of death threats and doxing and sort of the usual things that happen in those circumstances. In the aftermath of that, I ended up with a social media following that thought I was a comics journalist covering breaking news, which is not really what I do. So I decided that for a year, every month, I would do some sort of deep dive into an issue of racial or social justice, looking at things like, okay, we talk about police militarization, but how did that actually happen? Or after the assaults on Asian Americans began picking up, really looking at how have racism and sexism always been so entwined in prejudice towards Asian Americans. So I did that for about a year. But meanwhile, in the background, I was quietly working on this book, Feeding Ghosts. And oh, actually, one more thing that factors in. Um, the other thing that I do is sort of multidisciplinary museum shows where I'll do a deep dive researching a topic and then show the firsthand information, but also create paintings about that history. So this is a show that I did at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, where back in the Monterey Bay, there was a series of Chinatowns, but they were all destroyed. And the museum happened to be across the street from the final site. And so I spent about 6 months really researching this history, learning that because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and as land became more valuable with the railroad expansion, basically it's the same old story. Like the Chinese fishermen had set up villages in land that was first worthless, but then once it became valuable, the white population found ways to drive them out. And so I ended up turning the gallery into a timeline going back to the 1500s, where viewers could come in and they could look at all these history, they could see the newspaper articles and the quotes. This painting on the right is responding to legislation that was passed that made the act of ancestor exhumation illegal. And the board on top was actually a Chinese gravestone. And the reason that it was preserved is because a white family had stolen it and built it into a treehouse. And the museum let me go through all their archives and look at the material so that I could basically display everything together. So as the timeline progressed, and my own family story started to come in, that's when I started to bring in the in progress pages from what became this book, Feeding Ghosts. So the show ended with some of the first pages that I had drawn for this book. And then I was joking with the museum staff and I said, oh, well, we should just build a replica of my studio and then I could just bring my research library and like people can see all the drafts and process. And they said, okay, sure. And so that was the final part of this exhibition is people could really kind of take a peek behind the scenes and see how it was all made. And that kind of gives you, I think, a little bit of the backstory to understand the book that I made, where I wasn't a graphic novelist before this. I was a very multidisciplinary artist who was really interested in history and the question of whose stories get to be told. Um, and the book is almost 400 pages. This is just to kind of show you a sense of scale. And it took me 9 years, start to finish. And to give you a little bit of the backstory, this is my grandmother, Sun Yi, and she was a journalist in Shanghai during the communist takeover. And she ended up having a fling with a Swiss diplomat, which is why I don't look more Chinese. And because she had been writing for pro-nationalist newspapers, she found herself on the wrong side of history. And so she was arrested repeatedly, forced to write false confessions, and was put through Maoist-era thought reform, which unfortunately broke her mind. Eventually, she and my mother were able to flee to Hong Kong just before the Great Leap Forward. And once they got there, my grandmother wrote a memoir, 8 Years in Red Shanghai, about her experience of being the single mother while being persecuted by the communists. And because there was so little information coming out of mainland China during that time, the book became an overnight sensation and it was selling out left and right. Um, Unfortunately, it ended up being pirated, so my grandma wasn't really paid for that, but she used the money that she did receive to put my mom into an elite boarding school in Hong Kong, and that's where my mom learned English. And then once my mother was safe, my grandmother had a mental breakdown, and she ended up put in Castle Peak, which was Hong Kong's first mental institution. So at that point, my mom was taken on as a charity case and basically raised as an orphan by this boarding school. And because of the stigma around mental illness, she didn't tell anyone about her mother. And so she would sneak out on the weekends to go visit her mom. The long and the short of it is eventually my mom came to the US on a college scholarship and she brought my grandmother with her. So I grew up with my grandma living in my nuclear family, but my mom didn't teach my brother and me Chinese, and she didn't really speak English. And she was also very heavily medicated on antipsychotics. And so we were never really able to communicate. And I had a pretty complicated relationship with my mom and basically got out the first moment I could and became the feral adventurer and spent my 20s really sort of running away from this family darkness that I knew eventually I was going to have to turn around and face. And so shortly after my 30th birthday, I realized it was finally time to start to tell this story, and I began working on feeding ghosts. And my grandmother died in 2012, but this is me and my mom and my grandmother's younger sister in Suzhou. Um, and basically, yeah, I spent the entire of my 30s making this book. Um, the book starts by throwing the reader pretty immediately into the journey that my mom and I took retracing when she and her mother fled China. And I really root the book in that relationship. So even though it's teaching a lot of history, it's really about me and my mom. And I go into about 100 years of Chinese history that is not broadly taught in the US. And the book opens with a timeline that contains a lot of information. And you might be wondering, how do you avoid crushing your reader with this barrage of facts and relentless darkness? And I do that in a couple of ways. The first is I guide you. I am in the book as a character. I am literally pointing to things. I am wrestling with history with you, along with my trusty paintbrush dinosaurs, Norbert and Winnie. These are actual objects, like they do sit on my desk. They are not fabricated for this book. The second thing is everything is rooted in my relationship with my mother. That is what time and time again I come back to. And the third thing is cowboys. The book is really about what are the stories a country tells itself about who it is? What are the myths that we rely on? And so I kind of frame the tension between me and my mother as being between the different values of the American cowboy and the good Chinese daughter. And it's a kind of humorous metaphor, but also something that's really serious. And as the book has gone out in the world, it's been getting all of these accolades. But the one that I really care about is surprisingly humorous, because it is really dark history, and I have tried very hard to keep this thing funny. So if you read the book, you'll find all sorts of things referencing that I was a child born in the mid 80s. So you'll get the Royal Tenenbaums and viewfinders and the Little Mermaid and stuff like that. And the reason I choose to use devices like this is because they're a way to talk about this history with alleviating some of the weight. And so I talk about how my grandmother and Mao's China both lost their tether to reality like Russian nesting dolls. Two insanities at once separate from each other and fundamentally entwined. The book always follows the same format of talking about broad history and then how it impacted my family. And so I thought I would just give you an example of that by talking about the campaign to eliminate 4 pests. So these are some photographs of one of Mao's many crusades to change the reality of the Chinese countryside. And I'm just going to read a section from the book. In 1958, Mao launched the campaign to eliminate 4 pests: flies, mosquitoes, rodents, and sparrows. The entire country was conscripted for the effort. Even school kids did their part, meeting quotas of animals killed. They'd bring severed rat tails to school as evidence of their patriotism. Their contributions tallied on public leaderboards. Sparrows were targeted for their role in eating crops, and over 1 billion birds were killed. Beaming citizens marched in public parades, bandoliers of dead sparrows across their chests as they pushed sparrow-shaped floats draped in bird corpses. The tragic irony came later, when it was discovered that birds had played a seminal role in eating insects that fed on crops. This decimation of sparrows actually catalyzed mass starvation. But it was the technique for their slaughter that really got me. In it, I saw echoes of what happened to Sun Yi. Rather than killing the birds directly, Mao largely took an oblique approach. He mobilized the masses, turning out the whole nation with pots and pans. For days on end, the loyal patriots made raucous noise anytime the birds tried to land, keeping them on wing until they dropped dead from sheer exhaustion. In the end, they were destroyed by their own fear. It was during these frenzied, anxious months of flight that my grandma both wrote her memoir and began to lose her mind. And so that's really the format the whole book follows, is looking at, again, the broad history and then how it impacted the microcosm of one family. And I'm just going to read you one long section before we turn it over to a Q&A. And this is, I chose this section because it combines pretty much all of the themes that I touch on in the book. When I interviewed my mom about these years, she told me how Castle Peak operated with a system of bribery as the norm. If you wanted humane treatment, you had to use bribes. You want a scoop of rice? Bribe. You want a blanket? Bribe. Even though Sun Yi had long since broken up with her ex-boyfriend, Uncle, he still visited her in Castle Peak and would give her money to use for bribes. But Sun Yi didn't use any of it for herself. That's because the Chinese are loyal, not like Americans. She instead kept it to give to my mom, telling her, "You can't be growing up around all those rich girls without any pocket money." When I traveled to Hong Kong, I met some of my mom's classmates, and one in particular, Kim, was extraordinarily generous in welcoming me into her family. She belonged to a multi-generational Eurasian dynasty. So even as I spent my days poring through research materials about these webs of powerful Eurasians, I was invited into the midst of one. Kim took me everywhere, sharing her city with me and telling me stories of a version of my mother I'd never met. Oh, we called her the beautiful one. So pretty, but she was so rebellious, so naughty. Even as my mom's classmates revealed more of her to me, she was a troublemaker, your mom, and fearless. I shared what she had kept hidden. One day we went for a walk around a reservoir with her dog, Zucchini. We had no idea about any of it with your mom. There's this phrase in Cantonese, chai lung. It's hard to translate. It's not quite pity. It's where something is just so sad, you feel almost physically struck by it. Your mom, her mom. It's just so chai lung. So unbelievably sad. I just wish she would have told us. But she said nothing. She carried it all herself. If we'd known, we could have helped. I'm not surprised that my mom played her cards so close. For my entire life, she was almost pathologically committed to never allowing anyone outside our family to help her. When she met me in Hong Kong, I asked, "Why did you keep your mom's condition a secret?" They couldn't have done anything. They couldn't have helped. I made myself very tough, very independent. I didn't need anyone to help me. I made myself like the leader of a gang. I taught them I was someone they shouldn't mess with. I made it clear that if someone punched me, I punched them back 5 times. But wasn't it lonely, having to carry it all yourself? Well, of course, but that was just the situation. I remember on the weekends, I'd take the bus out to Castle Peak. Back then, it was just countryside, and the ride would take hours. Sun Yi was so unpredictable. The whole time riding out there, I never knew which grandmother I was going to meet. Sometimes I get all the way out there and arrive only to have her tell me, I need for you to leave. She'd always try to hold herself together when I was around. So on the days she couldn't do that, I had to go away. 2016. 50 years later, I took that same long bus ride out to Tunwan, retracing the journey my mother used to take when she went to visit her mother in Castle Peak. Hong Kong was unrecognizable, the countryside replaced by densely packed high rises. I didn't know what to think. What does one hold in their mind when going to see the mental hospital that held the grandmother they never really knew? I felt my mother's childhood presence with me as I walked to the entrance, the two of us closer than we'd ever been. I felt our chests rise in unison as we drew a final breath before closing ourselves off, bracing to meet our mother's pain. Both of us trying to be good daughters, both of us trying to understand. There is no way for me to ever know what exact treatments my grandmother received, but I sifted through Castle Peak's collections, seeing firsthand the straitjackets and electroshock machines that might have been used on her. I tried to imagine her within those bonds, the weight of rough cotton pressing on my own arms, the heft of bamboo clenched beneath my teeth. Added room for when the patients run amok. Straitjackets, key for locking the female ward. Electroconvulsive shock machines, with bamboo gags to bite down on. Later, I dove into the documents of the Hong Kong Public Records Office. My mind reeled at the contradiction of what I found there. Catering receipts for cream puffs for the hospital's grand opening, zines of art and writing produced by patients, photos of smiling white men unveiling placards, newspaper headlines declaring Castle Peak a paradise for the mentally ill. I sent my mom some of the material I'd found. There's articles about how they had arts and crafts classes and gardens. Maybe her life in there wasn't so bad. Her rebuttal arrived immediately and forcefully. That's all just BS propaganda. It wasn't like that at all. It wasn't a place where people were cared for. Later, I read my mom's journals from visiting her mom. She described the wards as a cold, dark prison. When my mom came to meet me in Hong Kong a few weeks later, she brought up the documents I'd sent. I found myself having a very visceral response to what you sent. Those were lies, just lies. I watched her shift from anger to sadness, two emotions she treated as synonyms. I'm just so angry. I'm not surprised there was an enormous disconnect between the public descriptions and private realities of Castle Peak. China has always been stunningly good at imposing top-down narratives, regardless of the facts on the ground. I already touched on how the Great Leap Forward and my grandmother losing her mind happened at the same time. But I haven't got to the part about false evidence yet. Across the entire country, scientific impossibilities were being reported as concrete, unquantifiable fact. Mao traveled throughout rural China, visiting small villages and witnessing these marvels. By cover of darkness, farmers would rip out fields of wheat and replant them into false patches, placing them in impossible densities to show how the fields had tripled their productivity. I found one picture where a pack of smiling young children stood proudly atop one of these fields. The wheat grew so thick it could support even the weight of their glowing cheeks and revolutionary hearts. But below the surface, a hidden bench supported the illusion. This was nothing less than the wholesale repudiation of reality, conducted on a national scale. Throughout the country, the situation grew more dire. Desperate for food, people ate the bark from trees, though they'd repaint them to hide evidence of famine when Mao came through to inspect. People consumed inedible sweet potato vines, and many, unable to process them, died from constipation. As village residents fled to the cities in hopes of finding food, some left their children behind. They dug holes by the side of the road, too deep to climb out, but shallow enough to be heard, in the hopes that someone with more resources would save them. But most appalling of all, families were forced to eat children they could no longer feed. One account even describes cannibalism pacts, where people traded kids with their neighbors so they didn't have to eat their own offspring. Even as people devoured the leather of their shoes and the bricks of their homes, the government declared crop production had soared and continued to export grain during this time of plenty. Today, the Chinese government acknowledges 15 million deaths. Historians place that number as high as 46 million. I want to make clear that my family was spared the worst of this. I asked them what their lives were like during this period. My mom translated Great Auntie's reply. She said that things were better in the cities than in the country, so people from the rural areas would come seeking food. Everyone was starving, but the people who lived in the cities would get vouchers for food. But the rural people didn't. You wait in line all day, hoping there would still be something left, and the people from the countryside would beg. Please, one bite. Anything, anything. Sometimes people would die right there while you were waiting in line. Their bodies would just lie on the ground. My mom finished translating, and Great Auntie began another story, her voice calm and level. But Auntie's words collapsed something within my mother. Her armor dropped. Her eyes turned wounded and animal, filling with tears as I wished I could understand what was being said. She's saying that during those worst years of hunger, my mom was sending them packages from Hong Kong. She says the cooking oil was the most important. Those packages were what allowed them to survive. Oh God, oh God. This was during the height of my mom's craziness. She had nothing, nothing. No money, not even her mind. She was in and out of hospital. And yet somehow, she was still finding a way to send help to her family. Tessa, I need you to see the strength of this culture. I want to be able to understand my mom's Chinese culture in the way she needs here. But it's an impossible ask. What she wants is for me to be shaped by it, to be the byproduct of it. It's the great tragedy of immigrant parents. They open the door for us. and we betray them by walking through it and becoming children of a different world. And that is where I will end and see if you have some questions. Yeah, the question was, how did I figure out how to draw myself? And I would say a lot of awkward trial and error. It's, the thing with comics is that you're always reducing things to more basic shapes. And so someone with like a round face and angular jaw, I'm just like, it's once I sort of decided on the shape of my face, the rest, and like glasses also, it's like a way of making it easier to differentiate. Like I like did some revisionist history because I didn't get glasses until I was probably 11 or so, but I draw my childhood self with glasses just for the continuity for the viewer. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's always awkward deciding how to draw yourself. So eventually you just have to settle on one awkward choice and keep doing it. Yeah, there's so much history that really I think isn't broadly known, and a lot of that is really intentional. It's not that it's somehow magically been forgotten. It's that it's been actively repressed, and there's been so many different generations of basically there being really strict consequences of talking about it, and it's been really effective. And even growing up in a family where I knew that my grandmother had written a memoir that was very critical of the Communist Party, I really didn't know a lot of this history, even though my family lived through it. So, but it's I will say that in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of books that have come out that have really gone into this, where people have been able to get into archives and shine a light on some of this past. So there are a lot of resources now. Oh, that's a wonderful question of how did this change in the publishing journey. So I will say a big part of this was that having a non-traditional background, kind of coming up as a visual artist, much more so than a writer, I think it gave me some license to make something that broke some of the standard rules. And I taught myself how to be a graphic novelist for this project. It wasn't a medium that I worked in before this. And I knew that's because it would allow me to tell this density of history in a way that was still accessible for a general audience. And so I think that was probably my first big conscious choice with a mind towards publication eventually, was to do it as a graphic novel rather than a written book or a series of paintings or something like that. And I think also because I did have basically this gift handed to me on a silver platter by having this true story within my family and having the unusual resource of my grandmother's own memoir to draw from, and the fact that her story was covering essentially 1949 to the Great Leap Forward. It really gave me a leg up when it came time to get interest from publishers, because there was so much that was already in place. And so sort of what I felt was that my task was to get my skill set as a comics artist and graphic novelist to a point where I could do this story justice. And I spent many, many years learning the form. So when it did come time to sell the book, I was really fortunate that there was a lot of interest. And so I was able to talk to a number of different publishers to sort of see what their vision was, and whether or not it would be a good fit. And in talking to some graphic novel publishers, it was clear that they would have tried to force me into a more traditional format. Like this book breaks a lot of panel structures. It does a lot of things that technically like you're not supposed to do in comics. And so I opted to go with MCD, which is a division of FSG. So it's basically like the weirdo innovative kids table of a really established publisher. And so the books that they generally publish are things with really solid literary chops that are also doing something really strange. And so that was another calculated choice where I went with a publisher that I think saw I was doing something weird and wanted me to pursue that rather than shy away from it. Um, and yeah, it has been really gratifying that I think the press coverage and the way that this is being received is like fully leaning into the fact that it is a weird graphic novel that sort of breaks with form a bit. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I grew up in a town of 350. And so once my mom moved my grandma there and she didn't speak English, there was literally no one she could communicate with except for her daughter. And so I think for me, Chinese culture was something that I tried to understand through negative space in my family because, like, my mom so clearly wanted my brother and me to be Chinese, but I don't think that she understood by raising us in a context where we could never see what a functioning community looked like. There was no way for us to really learn those lessons because so much of Chinese culture is about the relationship to family and showing up not as an individual. And you kind of can't learn that if you're not part of that fabric. And so I think the way that working on this book and learning more about this history really connected me more to my Chinese heritage was through the fact that working on this really caused me to have a lot of other Chinese American friends and to become a part of those communities and to work with those histories. And so, in a way, it's retracing that history sewed me into that fabric that my mom so desperately wanted my brother and me to have. And so, I think in a way I've arrived at what my mom always wanted, which is to understand Chinese values and understand what it means to show up. And in a way, I look at this book as being me fulfilling my duty to my mother and my family, um, and in a way like closing that loop and becoming more of what she needed me to be. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's been really amazing about having this book out in the world is so many people have been reaching out and sharing their family histories with me. And because so many people were leaving mainland China right around 1949, it's like there are entire generations where we're all formed by the same thing. And it's amazing talking to other people with immigrant parents who left the same thing, like kind of comparing notes and seeing all of the parallels. And I think for me, because my grandma basically never stopped writing about her past. She never really left those interrogation rooms where she was questioned about her reality over and over again. And so intergenerational trauma within my family was so literal. It was like really clear. I'm like, this is a woman who has never left 1950s China. And so I think the way out is through, and that I hope readers will feel like they have more agency to look into those pockets of their own histories that are maybe blank spaces on the map. And I do think that I was really lucky in that my mom was willing to talk about this. And I know with a lot of other Chinese American parents, there's not that willingness. And actually, one of the things that came out of that show I did for the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History is we made a deck of Uno cards essentially based off of those paintings that had questions that you could use to like talk to people about family histories, and people were coming into the gallery and playing it with their families. And I know there's another card game, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically like a deck of cards specifically to get your immigrant parents to talk about the past. um, where it's like sometimes I think they do want to share those stories, but they don't know where to start. And finding some sort of way in is really helpful. So I think that's actually been probably the most gratifying part of this book going out is the people who have reached out and said, this has helped me talk to my parents. And it's a talking point for conversation to sort of learn more about what their families are carrying. Yeah, what homecoming means in the context of memoir. Ooh. Um, Yeah, well, so in the epilogue of the book, I learned a little bit of Mandarin for this book, so 我会说一点点. But I remember like it wasn't until the end that I learned that the word for writer was 作家, and that it's the words make and family and home. And I remember when I saw that, it was just so beautifully literal. Um, and I think in a way, this whole book was an attempt to finish what my grandmother started, because she wrote a memoir that ended with her getting out of China. And it was really pretty heartbreaking because it was supposed to be a new beginning, but instead, she never left the past. And so for me, I think homecoming meant needing to step into my grandmother's role to become a writer, to become a zuojia, and basically finish the race for her and carry her over that finish line, that because of the political circumstances that she was living under, she didn't have the freedom to finish. And I think that ultimately, like, my job as an American with so many more privileges was to go back and basically say, okay, I am in a place where I can carry this, and therefore I need to bring all of us home. Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I talk towards the end of the book about that very thing, that I came at this book hiding behind two things that really turned out to be true, not be true, which was that there is such a thing as objective history, and that you can hide in facts to avoid feelings. And the book was in a way an attempt to destroy my own false objectivity and really wrestle with some of the emotional fallout of what had happened to my mom and grandmother. And I do think it ultimately, yeah, this book taught me how to stop hiding behind those things. And I do feel a peace that I did not have before I embarked on this. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I spent I spent the entirety of my 20s running from the story and kind of going to the most extreme locations I could, trying to break free of my family ghosts. And I mean, Chinese ghosts are so pushy. They will tell you what they want, and they will not leave you alone until you do what they need. And so yeah, my ghosts told me, they said I was on a solo bike trip, and I was biking up a mountain, and they just hijacked the landscape, and they told me someone has to feed the ghosts. And that is why I then spent 9 years making a book called Feeding Ghosts. So this is me giving them the little like mandarins on their altar. But yeah, I just did it in the form of a book because they told me I had to. Thank you so much.